Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce and to move us on to the next topic, which is just more of a physical, as I said, overview. Uh, Abby Ostovar, Abby is a water policy specialist with Montgomery and Associates, which has been a consulting firm working in this basin for quite some time in the development of what we refer to as the groundwater sustainability plans. Again, I want to make sure myself and all of us that are so accustomed to the lingo, we're not just talking in acronyms. So Perret, in a couple things, used the term GSA, which stands for Groundwater Sustainability Agency, and SGMA, which stands for Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. SGMA was passed in 2014, and it's what the state is now working on. There are over hundreds, 150, 200 GSAs across the entire state. So it's my honor to introduce Abby as both a colleague and a friend, and so take it away on the overview. Any last cards before I couldn't do my compilation work?
I'm not used to this treatment. I'm also not used to having my screen in front of me for the Zoom days. So I'm going to give you a high-level overview of water in the Salinas Valley. Some of you will know a lot more, especially about certain parts of the valley, either from attending meetings or from working in the valley. But I'm trying to get everybody on the same page generally about what's going on here in a couple minutes. So for those of you not familiar with the Salinas Valley in Monterey County, here's a brief map here going from the county line down there towards the bottom, kind of slicing across the bottom, all the way up to the Monterey Bay at the top. The groundwater basin does extend down towards Paso Robles, but because it is mainly recharged through surface water, a lot of that recharge comes from Lake Nacimiento and San Antonio to those large reservoirs down there at the bottom. I don't know if I have that's too fancy for me. So it operates somewhat separately there, and that's part of the reason we divide it along there. And so as you go from those lakes there coming into the Salinas River, it flows northwards, is joined by that other blue stream there, the Arroyo Seco River. And all of those recharge the groundwater basin and flow out to the Monterey Bay, a bit north of Marina, south of Elkhorn Slough. We're currently up there in that little gray diamond, the city of Salinas. And as you can see, this is a topographic map, so it's showing you the the land elevation, and it's flanked by both the Sierra de Salinas on the western side and then the Gavilan Range on the right-hand side. If you drive southward on 101, that basically follows the valley, so you're driving down the valley, in between the mountains, in a mainly agricultural area. And we'll talk a little bit more about how agriculture really is the lifeblood of the Salinas Valley. And you can somewhat see it here just as far as most of it is along that green area along the valley floor there. So water use and groundwater use in particular really does underpin our economy here. These stats are from 2018, so we've had inflation since then and more economic growth. But almost $5 billion in direct economic outputs come from the agricultural industry in Monterey County, most of that from the Salinas Valley. That also has ripple effects because those direct outputs are respent on other goods and services in the valley, and in total it's about $12 billion over that at this point. That really you can contribute to agriculture in the county. So it is very important to balance agriculture as well as drinking water and other uses in the valley. And if you think of your neighbors, people sitting side by side or that are around you, 1 in 5 jobs come from the agricultural sector, and higher than that within the Salinas Valley itself. So when it comes to the water side of things, agriculture uses about 91% of the water in the Salinas Valley. You can see on the top there, the agriculture is the big blue part of that. There's also urban use, which includes industrial, which is about 9%, and then 0.2% of water use goes to rural domestic use, individual households and systems that aren't on a larger system. And then when it comes to the type of water, most of it is groundwater. As Perret mentioned, we are, as an agency, we focus on groundwater, but really it's all connected here. So you need to think about water as a part of that broader system. And as you're thinking about water supplies, water resilience of your water supplies, it's all interconnected, but 96% comes from groundwater, much of which is recharged from precipitation and surface water as well, but directly used from groundwater, and only 1% directly from surface water and 3% from recycled water. And this matters for everybody, all users. So in the urban sector, 96% of the urban sector relies on groundwater. 100% of the rural residential households rely on groundwater. 96% of agriculture relies on groundwater. And there's also environmental or ecological users that depend on groundwater as well. This water use over time has led to a number of challenges. For those of you who have been around for a while, you've probably heard us talking about this. But some of the key ones are that as we are pumping the groundwater out of the ground, groundwater levels have declined over time. And that's led to a loss of overall groundwater in storage, that availability of the water to use. And as we've lowered those groundwater levels, it's enabled seawater to intrude from the ocean, which compromises the quality of our water supplies. To go a little more in depth, as far as groundwater levels go, if you think back, we had a couple really dry years. 2022 was the third of 3 dry years here. Not a lot of rain, stopped sending reservoir releases down the water and down the river in 2022. And this shows groundwater level monitoring wells. And specifically, I want you to focus on those red ones, which are the critically low groundwater levels. By critically low, they're below the 2014 to 26 drought levels there, which are points we've defined as that's pretty low. We don't want to go below those levels. So you can see a good number of red dots up there at the end of that dry period, 2022. Certainly more in the northern part, but some sprinkled throughout the valley. And then the yellow are the low groundwater levels, but not critically low. And then where we want to be at are the green dots. Those are the more sustainable groundwater levels. So we had 3 dry years. Then we had all those winter storms, right? You remember those big storms in the winter? We had a lot of flooding along the Salinas Valley. And it was like, okay, what is this going to do? How is this going to affect groundwater levels? Are we going to get it all back? Here's what we saw after that year. From the year prior, the fall of 2022 to the fall of 2023, this is the annual change in groundwater levels in those monitoring wells. The darker blue and purple are the greatest increases. So you can see, especially in the middle of the valley along the Arroyo Seco, Greenfield area, big increases, even up to over 20 feet, which is quite a bit for groundwater levels. And then as you get towards the northern part, some increases, some light green dots hovering closer to 0, but also some yellow and reds, which are getting us into the negatives, meaning that groundwater levels didn't rebound. They actually went down even in that wet year. And so you can see a couple red dots there at the very top, which extend down to more than 20 feet of decline in that really wet year. So overall, yes, increase, but not everywhere, and certainly different across the valley. To compare with what I just showed you before, those critically low groundwater levels, the red dots here on the left after that 3 dry years to after the wet year in 2023, you can see that it's better. Fewer red dots, more green dots, so more wells that are at sustainable levels, but still quite a few yellow dots of low groundwater levels and still some red dots indicating critically low groundwater levels. So we have areas that aren't rebounding or aren't rebounding enough during those wet years. So what are the implications? We have lowering of groundwater levels. One of the implications is that it reduces our groundwater in storage. And typically we're not concerned about what's the overall quantity down there, because there's a lot of groundwater down there, but it gets harder and harder to use, and there are different negative impacts from using that. So you want to maintain the groundwater levels and groundwater storage at a level that doesn't give you those negative impacts. This shows you the long-term losses since 1944. So Monterey County Water Resources Agency has tracked groundwater levels since 1944. And this chart shows you different parts of the valley, what the average groundwater levels have been. The average groundwater and storage has been, which is based on groundwater levels, but also takes into account the storage capacity of the aquifer system. So as a result of those groundwater level declines, we have a decline of groundwater and storage, less storage of groundwater in the aquifer system. That means less water to use, less supply to be able to be used. And it's exacerbated by droughts. And that's what you can really see here. We're starting on the chart in 1944. Some areas are declining more. Other ones kind of dip down and come back up. But you can see around in the 1990s, all of the areas, or all but one of the areas, really dipped very low. Again, in the 2015, 2016 drought there. And then You can see the last little dip at the end that was coming down at 2022 before areas sprung back up. So during those drought years, we have really, really dire situation. So one of the main impacts is seawater intrusion. And this one we care about because it is extremely difficult and extremely challenging to address, just the way that seawater intrusion operates in the aquifer system. Just a conceptualization of the aquifer system, this area is a little more complex than, or a lot more complex than a typical bathtub aquifer. It does start in South Valley over on the right-hand side as one main aquifer, but then as you get closer to the coast, it fans out into a layered aquifer system. So you have these high clay areas that are relatively impervious to groundwater movement across them. So you have separated aquifer system closer to the coast. And as we've lowered groundwater levels down to negative 100 feet below sea level, 130 feet below sea level, groundwater wants to flow to the areas of lowest groundwater level, and so seawater has intruded in the upper two most aquifers, the 180 and 400-foot aquifers. So, now, there have been a lot of efforts to address this. This is not new. Monterey County Water Resources Agency identified this back in 1944, so we've had decades working on this, and they've done a lot. We have the two main reservoirs that the Water Resource Agency developed, San Antonio and Nacimiento, down there. It's kind of off the map, I suppose. And then part of those reservoirs are operated to recharge the groundwater basin, as well as for a number of different reasons, but it does recharge the groundwater basin, and it gets surface water supply down to the coastal area to use in lieu of groundwater. So those areas where their aquifers are compromised due to seawater intrusion, they're able to supply a combination of surface water, stored surface water from the reservoirs, recycled water produced by Monterey One Water, and then some groundwater to what's called the Castroville Seawater Intrusion Project. Many of you, as you've been driving around, have probably seen those purple pipes out there. Those are the CSIP pipes out there delivering the water. So there've been a lot of efforts, and they have made quite a bit of impact. This chart here is by the Water Resource Agency, and it shows from 1944, I know the numbers are small, to current day, the land area that has intrusion below it. And so you can see that the rate of decline has slowed down, particularly after they put in place the Castroville Seawater Intrusion Project. And so the rate has declined quite a bit, but we're still seeing some intrusion. Where that is on the map there. So I mentioned there were two aquifers. The uppermost aquifer shows you where the leading edge, or what we measure is typically the 500 milligram per liter chloride isocontour, that's what it's called. That's the purple line there. So you can see that's heading right towards the city of Salinas. And then in the aquifer below that, the 400-foot aquifer, that's the red line on there. And so you can see, it's not just city of Salinas that we're getting close to, but Castroville is intruded in the upper aquifer and partially in that 400-foot aquifer. City of Marina as well. So our drinking water supplies and all of that agricultural land in between is having to address what do we do with seawater intrusion. And the lower aquifers below there have a whole other set of challenges associated with them as well. That's not it. Of course, there's more. As you lower groundwater levels in certain areas, we have shallower wells that go dry. We see nitrate contamination in groundwater wells. We see arsenic contamination, which is naturally occurring in certain parts of the valley, and environmental habitat degradation. So there's a host of different challenges that relate to our water use and water management within the valley.
Hey, Abby, can I I apologize, this is entirely my fault. I failed to say something as Abby got started. You obviously have got no cards on your table, and what we'd like to do is, for efficiency purposes, and also just to acknowledge that some people don't like speaking in public, go ahead and jot down questions. If you want to ask a question by mic, that's fine. We'll run the mic over to you, but we sometimes find if you just go ahead and jot a question down, and we'll collect them at the end. Maybe jot down the slide number, so if you've got a particular slide number you want us to refer back to, we'll go ahead and do that really quickly. So just as it's going along and you've got any questions, please just jot them down, and we'll cover everything. Sorry, Abby.
No, that's good. I'm a science nerd, so I'm happy to have side conversations and answer specific questions. All of this to say that we have fluctuation here. We have floods, we have droughts, and we need to plan for uncertainty. Groundwater levels go up and down, but we see negative impacts both with the flooding, like we had along the Salinas River last year, as well as with those dry periods, those drought periods. So we need to both plan and manage for uncertainty and those fluctuations, as well as bring groundwater levels back up overall in certain areas where we see that even after wet years, we don't have sustainable groundwater levels. Generally, how can groundwater levels be raised? At a really high level, there are two main mechanisms. Setting aside that addressing seawater intrusion is a challenge, and there are different ways to do that. It does relate to groundwater levels, but there's a whole host of feasibility studies and endeavors to look at seawater intrusion. But generally, we are where we are with groundwater levels because we've been pumping. We've been taking more water out of the groundwater basin at a faster rate than it naturally recharges. So you can reduce the amount that comes out of the ground, so reduce water use, reduce water pumping, or you can put more in the ground. By put more in the ground to recharge the groundwater basin, of course that varies where you are. Certain areas have more water that can be put into the ground, or how you get it into the ground is also something that needs to be considered in planning different actions. But those are your two main knobs you have to turn. Take less out, put more in. And here we're really focused on that middle one, having more efficient water use and decreasing the amount that comes out of the ground. There are feasibility studies, there's a lot going on by different agencies as far as actually putting actions in place to increase recharge, address seawater intrusion, do different feasibility studies. But this middle one is one that we don't like to talk about. It's a really scary area. But if you think about your checking account, I think is the analogy Perrette often uses, you can't just worry about what's going into your bank account, you also have to worry about what's going out, even if it's just in a planning sense, reaching towards the future. So while we acknowledge there's a lot in these other buckets, we're really gonna be talking the most about that middle part. How do we reduce the amount coming out of the ground? So hopefully that helped get folks on the same page. Many of you, as I mentioned, I know you know a lot more about this, and I'm happy to field questions and have side conversations. But I think I need to hand this back to Dave.
No, actually, you go ahead and hold it.
Okay.
If we get so questions. If anybody's got any cards that they had questions they wanted to write on, or if you want us to bring the mic over to you, we're happy to do that. Anything immediately that folks have got questions on? Yes, sir. Okay. All right.
Number 19, please.
Slide 19. Wow. How did that? What the?
Okay, just one back, one more down.
One more right there. That one? Okay.
Yeah, I just want to point out the environmental habitat degradation that's also most people tend to forget about. That's all. Thank you.
You bet. There was another question back here.
I was just wondering if anybody's done a study, I'm sure you have, about all the different types of crops that we actually grow in the Salinas Valley area and which ones are more water consuming than others, and if there's a possibility of pivoting to just growing crops that utilize less water, like other countries have done.
So again, keep jotting also questions down on cards, and we'll come around and get them from you.
Okay. So I'll partially answer your question, and I think Norm Groot will actually hit on this a bit more later. So there are reports and analyses every year. Monterey County Water Resources Agency tracks the amount of extraction, so the amount of pumping within the valley, and they have reports every year that look at how water intensive various crops are. So we have a good idea of what the crop usage is. Right, there isn't a mechanism, growers can grow what they want to grow, right? We're not controlling what crops people have. So we track what's being done, and the agricultural sector has a good bit of different actions that are working on conservation. Changing your crop use is one way to address that, but there are also other agricultural best management practices that can be put in place to reduce extraction.
And as Abby said, we'll be hearing from Norm from the farm here in just a bit, and I think he'll be speaking to that.
Hello. Quick question on the 91% ag slide. There's a certain percentage of that ag water that is returned to the groundwater to be reused. So it's a little misleading there. And it'd be nice to know what percent is, because if you're furrow irrigating, you're probably returning 75% of the water, but you're using twice as much. Drip, you're still returning some, but you're returning less, but you're using less. it throws those percentages off, it seems like.
Very good comment. So we can get at some of that through groundwater modeling. You're right that some does soak down into the ground. It varies in the part of the basin that you're in as far as how much actually really gets down to your usable aquifer. For two main reasons. One is that in some areas we have that thick aquitard along the top. So even if some of that water percolates into the ground, it's not going into the part of the aquifers that you're using.
And an aquitard is what?
Very good. It's an area of thick clay where that inhibits groundwater flow across there. Sometimes water can slowly get across, but generally it prohibits groundwater from getting across that aquitard into your main usable aquifer system. And this valley overall has a lot of clay, big, thick clay aquitards, little thin clay lenses that make it really messy. And it's not like a bathtub that you, as my 4-year-old does, you drop a cup of water in and that goes everywhere, right? It may have more of an impact in some areas than others. And the other factor that matters a lot is often our groundwater level is far below the ground surface. And so water may percolate into the ground, but if you don't have enough to really get down to the saturated area, it may not really contribute as much to your actual groundwater levels and groundwater basin.
With the regional board talking about nitrate leaching, it seems obvious that if nitrates are leaching, groundwater is pushing those down, so it is moving. And then at one point, we were even told by the ag commissioner, the state in the 50s, put your fertilizer in the groundwater and pump it back up. So there is movement there, and that's why I said that slide's a little misleading, without showing some sort of recycling from irrigation methods.
Very, very good point. And there are, so Preservation Inc., working with the Central Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board, is working on that side of things. And they're setting up a monitoring network now, and we're in collaboration with them to kind of bring the pieces together. Generally, yes. And some water does recharge the ground, and we can get at what that number is through groundwater modeling. But it's not a one-for-one, I guess, is the challenging thing. So, but
It's just good to point
acknowledge. Yeah.
That 91% doesn't leave the valley. It's not like the sewer system where it goes to the ocean.
Yeah, no, so it's an excellent point that there needs to be a little more nuance in the slide to accommodate for that. And also to the point that Abby was just making as I'm coming around over here on the irrigated lands regulatory program, you're going to hear a little bit of that from Norm as well, I believe. And that's an example of these layers of regulatory and statutory conditions that are layered upon you all that I spoke of earlier that we want to make sure that you are getting credit for and being accounted for, so that things that are being done to address water quality, water management, and water quantity are not falling into inappropriate silos, but rather is being looked at as sort of a mass balance, to use a water term. Let me bring the mic over here.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for saying that dropping groundwater in isn't like a bathtub. I think you're correct in that. That's what I believe as well. On the slide behind you, how to raise groundwater levels, you talk about the one about difficulty. The most difficult and scariest, most uncertain one is the decrease in pumping. Nobody wants to stop pumping water if they're operating, obviously. But do you believe that the decrease in pumping needs to happen in the geographic area where we have problems? Or is it a uniform, I mean, you just said groundwater isn't like a bathtub, so is there a uniform way to decrease pumping? And does every subbasin need to decrease pumping, or only those that are maybe overdrafted or having some specific problems? Thank you.
Lavalier mic came off again. Hold on.
Sure. You opened a whole can of worms. I'm going to partially answer your question. No, I mean, you're right that one thing you do on one side may or may not affect the other side of the groundwater basin. It really depends on where you're at, and that needs to be taken into account when figuring out what sort of actions need to be taken and where they're taking. It's not that one side totally doesn't affect the other side, but we do need to take into account that spatial variability, both geographically and vertically as well in the aquifer system. So.
I'm glad you have it on this slide. So for environmental, is that ever going to be tracked? Do you have a rough number? Because I believe for the state, it's 40% is gone, diverted to environmental. And I just feel for Monterey County, it's important we look to the larger state and areas that are not being managed properly that, we can do better on a local county level. I'm just curious because I know we do have endangered species.
Great question. So there are different types of ecosystems. There are plant ecosystems that have their roots that go down, and if groundwater levels are high enough, they may be drawing on groundwater. This lady over here is doing a whole, it's called groundwater dependent ecosystem verification, getting a hold on how do we measure that? How do we figure out where those ecosystems are? So there's the where do they exist question there. To quantify that, we're starting to get groundwater models that will enable us to get a better hold on the quantification. It's a bit different, though, than the in-stream ecosystems. So the 40% often comes from what goes into the Bay Delta area, the San Joaquin Valley, or San Joaquin River, and the Sacramento River. They have what's called, they have their specific plan to meet the Clean Water Act, and the state board has come down and said, roughly 40% in-stream flows is what you need. We don't have that in the Salinas Valley. It's not a set percent of in-stream flows here. However, Monterey County Water Resources Agency, in the operation of the reservoirs and the diversion facility that goes to the Castroville Seawater Intrusion Project, does have to meet the needs of the Endangered Species Act, and they do have processes underway to do what's called a habitat conservation plan. So, and that does tie to groundwater. There is interaction there, but it's more than just a number, right? You're looking at what is the impact of those species, and they care more than just water. It's the quality of the water, it's the ecosystem, it's what the river looks like in different areas, where they breed, whether they can reach the coast, whether the lagoon is open. So there's a whole host of factors in there, but it is something that is on the table and is actively being worked on, so.
So we have time for maybe one more question if there is one, otherwise we're going to go ahead and move on.
Thank you, Abby. When you look at reducing pumping, as a scientist, I say, how can you know you're reducing it if you don't know how much you're pumping? So my question is about metering ag. How can we do that? Is it within the scope of the GSA? And my second question is about agricultural best practices. When I drive down the valley, I see probably, 50% of the sprinkler systems are throwing the water into the air. They're not drip irrigation. So does the GSA have the ability to make rules on such things?
So we'll hear from Perrette from an agency perspective, and then we will hear from Norm talking a bit about the practices as well.
So the short answer is yes, we do have the authority as an agency. I would not go to the stick method first. I think I'm all about, can we incentivize? Can we motivate people to be more efficient? If you ask any of us, do you want to be a smart water user? I don't think any of us are going to say no. Who wouldn't? So I think we just have to find a way to connect the brain of ours, and like ag is all about business. It needs to make business sense for them. But also if there's no water in the future, that makes no business sense. So I think there's a way for us to start bridging the gap, and today's workshop or this series of that is exactly about that. What is the demand side of it? What can you do? What can we do? What makes sense to do? Versus working on the supply side. So definitely that is something that this agency will be working on both counts.
Also, to answer the other part of that with regards to tracking extraction, Monterey County Water Resources Agency and much of the valley does collect, people do report their extraction to the agency. So it is tracked, and there are processes underway, mainly through the Monterey County Water Resources Agency, but working with the Groundwater Sustainability Agency to expand that geographically as well, and to really look at that program and how it operates. So. And I think we're hanging a lot on Norm over here, but he's going to give you more in depth.
All right. Well, a round of applause for Abby, please, for the initial presentation.